Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. This is the second lecture of our 4-part lecture series that we're having for Women's March Towards Equity. This is a part of Hammonton celebrating their 150th anniversary and really preserving the past. If you want to, and maybe after the lecture with Pat Martinelli, please take a tour around. We just have a new exhibit in the art gallery downstairs. It's called Hammonton 150 Years of Industry. So we're highlighting all the different industries that the town of Hammonton has had a major presence in the town. But today we are lucky enough to have with us Pat Martinelli. She is no stranger to Kramer Hall. She's been here for many lectures. She's even stepped into a few classes and been a guest presenter. She's written 9 fiction books and non-fiction books, I'm sorry, that's okay. And a novel as well. And she is the curator of the Vineland Historical Society. So today she'll be talking about women's suffrage movement, and I will turn it over to her. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you.
With the lights, are we okay?
Go ahead, turn them off.
Perfect.
That's fine.
Enough light for you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. Thank you for allowing me to visit with you here this afternoon, folks. As Gina said, I have the privilege of working as the curator of the Vineland Historical and Antiquarian Society, which is located downtown in Vineland, in the same place where it has been for over 100 years. Our historical society is actually the oldest local historical society in the state, and we are headquartered in the oldest purpose-built museum in the state. We grew kind of rapidly, primarily because we were the only game in town and everybody used to bring us their stuff from all over South Jersey. So over the past 5 years since I've been there, I've been trying to make a point, in the midst of everything else, of returning things to their appropriate home. Because now that other communities have their own local historical societies, we feel it's only right that things go back to the places where they were born. I was born and raised in Vineland, and quite honestly, I'm thinking seriously of starting a new version of the 6 degrees of separation game. Because it seems like no matter which road you walk down, Vineland can usually be found as a stop along the way, if not the final destination. And the women's history movement, as a feminist, has always been a special interest of mine. And I'm delighted to say that myself and the other women on the board, and even the men, are very cooperative about moving forward with a lot of our research goals. And when I was asked to do something for Kramer Hall, this seemed like the logical topic because of Vineland's role in the resurgence of the women's suffrage movement in the 19th century. So, to get things started, I named this talk after Susan B. Anthony's quote, "Organize, agitate, educate must be our war cry." And as we move further into this talk, you'll see that there is a good reason why she called it a war cry and not just a rallying cry. Also, in the interest of full disclosure, I don't really consider myself to be an expert on this topic, but I'll do my best to keep you entertained and hopefully a little enlightened along the way. But if I do move past anything too quickly or don't cover it in depth enough, please understand that it's not due to lack of interest, it's more because this is a huge topic, and we'd be here for several weeks to even cover the basics if we were really to go in depth into a lot of it. So to better understand why the women of Vineland were so motivated to support the women's suffrage movement, we really have to turn the clock back to America after the days of the War of 1812, when the country was getting on track with industry and farming and development, and it was really starting to have a sense of itself as a nation. But by the 1830s, there was kind of a backlash growing in America as far as all of the industrialism and the business concerns were being perceived. The Transcendentalist movement began to question why people were so focused on material success as opposed to their inner development. So those of us who fall among the neo-hippie category of the 60s and 70s, we were predated by these folks for some of the questions that they were asking. And as I mentioned earlier, it just seems funny that as a species we never seem to quite learn, but that's a discussion for another day. Unfortunately, women were especially being marginalized at this point in time, because even though they had been in there and fought every step of the way alongside the men and, you know, dug out the fields and planted the corn and the crops and moved things forward, all of a sudden there was this idea that they needed to be protected, that they were too weak and fragile to look after themselves. They were still expected to pay taxes if they ran businesses and owned property, but they weren't allowed to have a voice in what was happening with those taxes and with the legal system as a whole. And women who were married didn't even have that advantage. That was exclusively single women. Women who were married really could not own or do anything without their husband's consent. And it wasn't until the Married Women's Property Act came along in the late 1830s that they began to have a little bit of a say in what was going on. And even then, that was contested every step of the way, because the Bible said women were weak and fragile. Women needed someone to look out for them. And these poor dear creatures, they just had to be protected really from the realities of life. It's that coordination thing, as you can see, a typical cartoon from the day. But within 10 years or so, the movement to reject that idea was starting to grow. The dress reformers were stepping up and saying women will be able to function better and think more clearly if they shed their corsets and long skirts.
Praise Jesus.
But still, everybody was asking, or a good many people were asking, why the inherent rights that were established in the Constitution did not equally apply to everyone. But still, it kept coming back to society said women shouldn't ask these questions. This should be the province of men. Fortunately, this is another one of my favorite slides, showing that these were what we were supposed to be concerned with, the height of our hair and the tightness of our waistlines. And just so you know, we actually did have the vote at one point in time. Between 1776 and 1808, women could vote. In New Jersey, you just had to own property. It didn't matter if you were male or female. But in 1808, New Jersey jumped on the bandwagon when the rest of the country said, no, we can't do that anymore. It can only be free white men. So women were shuffled off to one side. These two ladies refused to be dictated to by society. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who met in London in 1833, where they had planned to attend the World Anti-Slavery Convention. They were barred because they were women. It was too deep of a subject for them to understand. So they returned home, and for the next decade, traveled America, rallying women to understand that this attitude needed to be changed, and it was up to the women themselves to step up and take charge and do it. And in 1848, they organized the first women's convention at Seneca Falls in New York. And there, those in attendance signed a revised constitution that began, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." And during the course of my research for this, I discovered that a Vineland couple, Quakers by the name of George and Margaret Pryor, were actually present at the Seneca Falls Convention, and they signed the revised Constitution. So I'm getting a chill just even thinking about it, because now there's a whole new avenue of exploration that we're going to have to look into as to who were George and Margaret. Yes, did you?
Is this about the time when the Grimke sisters come into the picture?
The Grimke sisters,
Charleston.
yes. Yes, I didn't focus too much down there, so my recall
Well,
is...
then she
yeah.
came up to Philadelphia and stayed with the Quakers. And then she would give
Yes.
her anti-abolitionist speeches along with them. But she wasn't even allowed to speak if there were men in the
Yes.
audience. So that...
Yes. So, anyway, to continue,
This must be...
Ma, who was an abolitionist and member of the suffrage movement, had been a founding member of the Female Anti-Slavery Association. Stanton was a suffragist, abolitionist, and social activist who later served as the president of the first National Women's Suffrage Association. And the first convention at Seneca Falls, like you said with the Grimke sisters, prompted women to start stepping up and speaking out in ways that they had never had before. It's this coordination thing, you know, looking and changing slides and all that. At the same time that Stanton and Mott were organizing, Susan B. Anthony would rise to prominence as a leader of the women's suffrage movement. Once again, influenced by her long-held Quaker beliefs that social equality should apply to everyone. Anthony was so dedicated to the cause that she actually remained single in order to protest the fact that married women could not own property in their own right or make legal contracts. In 1856, she served as the New York State representative to the American Anti-Slavery Society and continued to travel extensively in support of women's suffrage. In the years that followed, she gave close to 100 speeches per year in towns throughout America and also worked on individual community suffrage campaigns. She helped organize the World Congress of Representative Women at the Columbia Exposition held in Chicago in 1892, where Vineland sent Mary Tillotson, a dress reformer, to speak. So once again, Vineland jumps into the mix. But we don't want to go ahead too quickly because in those intervening years, a lot was going on. The suffrage movement was gathering more and more momentum by the 1850s, but society said, no, this needs to stop. These women must know their place. So even though they were often beaten and jailed and went on hunger strikes to make their point, the women still persisted. Newspapers derided women for wanting to vote. And this was an attitude that would basically remain unchanged for the next 60 or 70 years. In fact, newspapers were the ones that coined the term suffragettes as a derogatory description for those who were involved in the movement. Granting suffrage would give women way too much personal freedom. It would unsex them. It would destroy the sanctity of the home because women were the guardians of the hearth and they needed to know their place. Seemed like a lot of work just to keep us from getting the vote, wasn't it, folks? But this is what they chose to do. But unfortunately, it wasn't society per se, or even the newspapers that forced the movement to grind to a halt. It took a war, the Civil War, to stop the movement in its tracks. As tensions climbed between the northern and southern states, many women decided their first responsibility was to support the cause of abolition as opposed to women's rights. So they stepped aside and changed direction, and they fought to free the African Americans who were held in slavery. But for many American women, the end of the war signaled a renewal of hope that their struggle for personal freedom would be taken seriously. In 1866, Stanton and Anthony formed the American Equal Rights Association, which was dedicated to the goal of suffrage for all. Women across America, whether they lived in states or in territories, began to answer this new call to arms. They read women's newspapers like The Revolution. They attended rallies in their hometown or went as representatives to larger cities where they could listen to speakers talk. But they weren't just women who were involved with these major leaders. It was people like John and Portia Gage, who just happened to be related to Frances Dana Gage. She was the sister of John, who traveled the nation to address packed lecture halls on the issue of women's rights. Frances was one of the speakers at Vineland's annual Strawberry Festival in June of 1866, and was probably a major influence on Portia's life and the direction that Portia chose to follow as far as social activism. With other local women, business owners like Abby Levitt and Susan Fowler and Mary Tillotson, yay Mary, Portia would continue to listen to speakers such as Lucy Stone and her husband Henry Blackwell, who spoke on equal rights at Plum Street Hall in Vineland on December 4th, 1866. Area residents were so enthused by what they heard that day that they were inspired to form an Equal Rights Association that very night at the end of the program. A few weeks later, on January 11th, 1867, the newly established organization held a convention at the hall and elected a slate of officers. However, to better understand these folks and what they were up to, I just want to give you a little bit of a background on Vineland. We believe this is actually the first map ever made of Vineland by Charles K. Landis, showing that at that point in time he wasn't planning a separate township and an internal city. It was all just Vineland. But Landis in 1861 even then had an idea about what he wanted for his town. He divided it into small plots, usually 10-acre farms, so that immigrants and anyone else who was interested could come there and actually afford, for the first time ever, to build a home, buy property, and settle in this new community. It was, as Mark has discovered, a revelation in how things were done in those days, because in those days usually the only people who could buy land were the people who could afford to buy thousands of acres, or at least hundreds of acres at one time. At the center, where you see the word Vineland, that was the heart of the town, 1 mile square, where people built their businesses and their homes, and then slowly started to expand into the outer areas that he planned to devote primarily to farming. Landis Avenue, which is still 100 feet wide, exceptionally broad for a thoroughfare at that point in time, cut through the heart of town. And the town itself was something you could find on any territory, or in any territory, any Wild West community, because it was primitive, it was basic, and just life was a struggle to sometimes get by. But Charles had big plans for his community. And in addition to Vineland being a success at business and industry, he saw it as a place where people would learn to think and grow as people. Spiritualists, liberals, philosophers, writers, artists, they flocked there because this was a place that made them feel welcome. It didn't matter if you were a dress reformer and dared to wear pants in public. You could walk the streets of Vineland, basically, and be unmolested. And this in itself was quite a novelty. By August of 1867, a mass meeting on impartial suffrage was held in Vineland. And I quote, "to consider the best means of bringing the question of impartial suffrage, irrespective of sex or color, more fully before the people of New Jersey." That same month, C.B. Campbell, a local spiritualist who supported the women's movement, received a letter from Susan B. Anthony that stated both she and Stanton would be willing to speak about the women's movement at Plum Street Hall on September 5th. The momentum from that meeting, out of Augusta speaking there, sorry about that, folks. The momentum from that meeting caused Vineland residents to organize a women's rights convention on November 29th and 30th of that same year, Whereas you can see the guest speakers included Lucretia and James Ma, Lucy Stone, H.B. Blackwell, and Robert Dale Owen, who was another social activist who traveled America trying to reform society. I apologize for this, folks. I must have been working on this a little too late last night. Local residents, including Augusta Bristol Cooper, who was not only a poet and a writer, but a pioneer social scientist, continued to meet regularly to discuss women's suffrage. And on October 15, 1868, they met at Plum Street Hall, which technically was the train depot, but on the second floor was a meeting place where people would regularly gather. And it was resolved on that day that the women would gather to go to the polls and participate in the first presidential election that was held after the Civil War. Both the Revolution and the New York Times took note when Portia Gage had attempted to cast her ballot in a local election in March of 1868. At that time, the men very politely said to her, "You can't vote, you're not registered." So since she was only there with her husband, Portia felt the polite thing to do was to stand aside. After that incident, Portia wrote to C.B. Campbell and said, "I was induced to offer a vote first because I felt it was a duty, and second out of curiosity. I wanted to know how men did behave at the polls. I feel stronger, wiser, and better for having come in contact with the political influence of last Tuesday. My fears were groundless, as the men I met there were quiet and well-behaved and treated me as respectfully as though I were in a church or a lecture room. Of course, I felt somewhat embarrassed being the only woman in the room, but I walked through being kindly greeted by some, not jostled or molested by any." Now that she had tested the water, Portia gathered together 171 other Vineland women, 4 of whom were African Americans, and I can't imagine the courage it took for them to step forward at this point in time. And that November, they showed up at the Union Hall, very well prepared to cast their votes. Once again, the men said, "You can't vote, you're not registered." The women smiled politely and said, "We've taken care of that." They had their table, they had their ballot box, and they had their separate tickets all printed up and ready to go. And the men of Vineland, being obviously very intelligent, they said, "Make yourselves at home." Imagine the scene that election day. Into an already crowded, smoke-filled Union Hall, the women slowly filter into the back of the room behind Portia. And if you look carefully to the upper left-hand side of the screen there, you'll see the ladies standing there. They're quietly dressed in their walking clothes, bonnets in place, gloves on their hands, some carrying canes or umbrellas. As the talk around them recedes, Portia steps forward and requests the opportunity to vote. They weren't legally allowed, but they voted anyway. And as we all know, the winner of that election was Ulysses S. Grant. In Vineland, he gathered 950 votes, as opposed to his opponent, Governor Seymour, Horatio Seymour, the former governor of New York, who only got 182. Among the women, Grant was obviously a popular hero because he received 168 votes, while Seymour only gathered 4. A few weeks after that incident, Anthony wrote to Campbell and said, "Vineland women did splendidly on election day and will no doubt continue to do the same. So send us all the good words." Why was it so important? Other individuals and other small groups had gone forward to voting places in different states to try and get their voices heard. But this was the first time ever in America, in the heart of South Jersey, that many women stepped up together in an organized front and presented themselves. And it caught on like wildfire throughout the country. Women read about it. They wrote letters to each other about it, and they said if they did it in Vineland, which was already known as a community of some culture and sophistication, they said if they did it in Vineland, we should do it too. So at long last, the movement had some purchase and was ready to move to the next level. Who was Portia Gage? And why did she feel compelled to organize the women in this fashion? Unfortunately, this is another one of my mystery people, because since it's only me and some dedicated volunteers and student workers, we don't have enough time to really study in depth all the people that we have records on at our place. So hopefully someday I'll come back and tell you her life story. We do know that the Illinois native was only 17 when she met and married John Gage, who was 11 years her senior, a charismatic businessman, and if you would see their wedding photos, you would know in a heartbeat why she fell in love. He was also an outspoken member of the Chicago Board of Freeholders. After making a fortune there in the flour mill business, the couple moved with their large family to Vineland in October of 1864, where they quickly became leaders of the community. John was an advocate of equal rights for women. John wanted to create a vocational school where women as well as men could receive training in different fields. And he was the president of the local chapter of the National Liberal League, and a spiritualist, which was an organization at that point in time which firmly believed in equal rights for all. And while Portia spent the early years of their marriage raising their 11 children, she soon became equally active in a variety of local causes. In July of 1868, many Vineland residents, as were many people everywhere, were delighted by the passage of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which allowed all persons born or naturalized within the United States the right to vote. They got a quick surprise when they realized citizen and voter were only defined as male. So in response to the fact that women were still being discriminated against, Portia became one of the organizers of the New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association that same year to try and take more definitive action. Now let's see, oh yeah, there she is. Another side note. This lovely lady, Susan Fowler, managed her own farm and stayed single until she was 80. And at that point in time, she said, I need a little help in running my farm. So she advertised for a man to come and help. A young man from out west, well, he was in his mid-40s at that point in time. He answered her ad and he said, but the only way I'll come to Vineland and work your farm is if you'll marry me. So at that point in time, Susan decided, okay, I'll get married if it's going to keep my farm afloat. As you can see, she was also a dress reformer and very proactive in that as well. But Susan, her pet peeve was the whole idea of paying taxes and not being legally represented. So for 20 years, she would write a protest letter to the politicians, and number 23 said, political slavery and social slavery go hand in hand. No class of people had or can have conditions for their highest development while denied a voice in the laws which govern them. An ignorant and enslaved motherhood is not conducive to the development of nobility and wisdom in her offspring. All of these great and menacing evils in society today, which all good men and women so deeply and justly deplore, are but the legitimate outgrowth of the past and present enslaved conditions of the mothers of the race. As we have sown, so must we reap. So, back to Vineland. Vineland, like many communities across America, continued to buzz with excitement as the momentum started on the election day continued. On December 2nd, the first Women's Suffrage State Convention was held at Plum Street Hall, and all the guest speakers came out. Unfortunately, While the women of Vineland were moving forward, the movement itself was starting to fracture because you apparently had too many chiefs or too many chefs and not enough people doing the grunt work. Dissension was spreading in the ranks because the leaders simply could not agree on how to run their campaigns. Anthony and Stanton felt the greatest impact would result from federal legislation, and they wanted the women to focus their energies just on contacting the politicians in Washington to move things forward. Lucy Stone and company felt that it was more important to go directly into the individual communities and speak directly to the women about the need for suffrage. And in the midst of that, you had Victoria Woodhull. Oh, Victoria. She not only challenged the beliefs of women in the suffrage movement, but she shook the stuffing out of America as a whole. She challenged people's beliefs on every level because in addition to supporting the women's movement, Victoria was a champion of the underclass. She was one of those people who said the workers are not respected anymore in America. They deserve to be respected. They deserve health care. They deserve food and clean conditions and all the right things to keep them working and keep them strong. She felt that the class divide was going to be a major problem in America, and nothing that we could relate to here today, but you know. Victoria first came in contact with Vineland because she was a supporter of the spiritualist movement, and she attended the very first New Jersey State Spiritualist Association meeting, which was held in Vineland in 1866, which if I ever get back to work on my book, you'll be able to read about someday. She was beautiful, charismatic, and dangerously intelligent by standards of the day. She also supported the concept of free love, which of course most people chose to interpret in the worst possible manner. But what Victoria was talking about was women should have the rights to get divorced if they're married to an alcoholic or somebody who beats them, or if they're forced to have child after child after child when they're tired of having kids. Unfortunately, that's the message that people heard and listened to. And by being involved with the spiritualists, she also wound up being exposed to another scandal that I'll tell you about in a minute. But in 1872, she actually was promoted by the Equal Rights Party as the first woman candidate for President of the United States. So, Hillary's got to live in her shadow. However, she was just so conveniently arrested a few days before the election and charged with obscenity because she published the story of the affair between the well-known minister, Henry Ward Beecher, who was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Elizabeth Tilton, who was a married lady who with her husband Robert were involved in the spiritualist community. Now this got to be quite a twisty story because Robert wound up suing Henry in court for alienation of affections, but at the same time Henry is also writing these biographical paeans to Victoria in the hopes that she will take him seriously as a potential mate. But Victoria, she went on. She became, however, the symbol for the opposition of what was wrong with the women's movement because the men would have to stay home and watch the babies while they followed her, the man tamer. How dare she? So in the meantime, the suffrage organizations were still hard at work trying to draw positive attention to their cause. But the gloves were starting to come off. In the summer of 1876, during the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, when America was celebrating its 100 years as a country, Anthony and Stanton decided it would make an ideal platform for their cause. After the presiding officer finished reading the Declaration of Independence, a group of women rather noisily approached the stage and presented him with a woman's Declaration of Rights that included 9 articles of impeachment regarding the treatment of women. They asked the government to give the women civil and political rights guaranteed them by the Constitution, but because this was such horrible etiquette, how could they do this? How could they interrupt this joyous occasion to do something like this? The men said no. Women said, we're loyal Americans. We fought to protect our country. We worked in the hospitals. We did everything that was asked of us. Why are we being told no? The plea fell on deaf ears. The women of Vineland continued to march. They continued to parade. Even though the original groups were getting a little older, they passed that desire on to the next generation. So they kept stepping up at every opportunity to participate. Now, you would think by this time, any right-thinking woman would say, we should get the vote. It's a good thing. Unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. In 1911, Mrs. Arthur Dodge organized the National Association opposed to women's suffrage, and they did everything they could to obstruct the effort to get the vote. They said women should not be involved with these kind of things. We should be protected from all these things. And a lot of women, unfortunately, were listening to them. You had to be the moral center of the home. That was your job. That's what you were expected to do. But at the same time, while a lot of women were listening, a lot still were not. And even then, at that point in time, a new leader was born right here in South Jersey, whose name was Alice Paul. Born on January 11th, 1885 at Paulsdale, a farm in Mount Laurel Township. She was the eldest of 4 children and a descendant of William Penn. From an early age, Alice recognized that her faith as a Quaker meant that she should try and do good for people. And she would often go with her mother to meetings of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And she listened and she learned. After she graduated from Morristown Friends School, Alice went to Swarthmore College, where she served on the Executive Board of Student Government. It was then that her interest in political activism started to grow. After graduating in 1905 with a bachelor's degree in biology, Alice didn't want to teach, which was basically one of the few professions that were open to women at that time. Instead, she spent a year working as a social worker in the fledgling social work movement at a settlement house on New York's Lower East Side. And what she saw there made her even more aware of the level of injustice that existed in America, especially where the immigrants were concerned. So she thought she could do some good, but she wasn't really sure that social work was her venue either. So she returned to college and received a master's degree in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1907. From there, she went to the Woodbrook Quaker Study Center in Birmingham, England. This was a decision that would not only change her life, but the lives of us all. It was at the university that she first heard Christabel Pankhurst, the daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, speak in public. The Pankhursts were suffragists who were not afraid to be out on the front lines, in the streets, and demand attention for their cause. When she later moved to London to work, Alice joined the Women's Social and Political Union. That was a militant organization the Pankhursts had organized. From what she saw, she thought to herself, these women had the right idea. That was the way you got things done. The time for talking was over. And before long, she was participating in the demonstrations and the marches and wound up being arrested 7 times, endured 3 prison terms in which they went on hunger strikes. And it was during this time that she met Lucy Burns, a lifelong friend and colleague who would later return with her to America. In August of 1909, she accepted an organizer's job at the WSPU and was sent to various cities throughout England to prepare the ground for demonstrations and other suffrage events. Determined to get the message across, she climbed to the top of buildings so that she could be heard when she was speaking to a crowd. She went to a political meeting at St. Andrew's Hall in Glasgow with another suffragist, and when they attempted to enter the hall, they were beaten by the police, while sympathetic bystanders attempted to protect them. That same year, they disguised themselves as cleaners to gain access to a meeting in the Guildhall in London, where the Lord Mayor was hosting a banquet for the Prime Minister and other cabinet members. When Asquith, the Prime Minister, stood up to speak, the women interrupted, screaming, "Votes for women!" They were arrested once again, and this time they were sentenced to 1 month's hard labor. They staged a hunger strike, but she wasn't released. They force-fed her and caused her so much physical harm that she wound up having to be carried out when she was finally released. In January of 1910, Alice returned to the States to recover from her experience and to develop a plan for suffrage work in America. She recognized that she was ideally suited for this role because her actions in England had drawn so much attention to her that she could become a public figure for the women's cause. So she resumed her studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where she earned a PhD in sociology, and began speaking, at first to small Quaker audiences, about her experiences in the British suffrage movement. But then she started to work on small suffrage campaigns in communities throughout America. Finally, when she was fairly well recovered, she moved to Washington to chair the organization's congressional committee. In 1913, she became one of the organizers of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, a group that would later be rechristened the National Women's Party. And I'm pleased to tell you that in my research for this, I discovered letters from Alice to the women of Vineland in our files. So, they organized marches and presented to Congress more than 500,000 signatures on petitions demanding women's suffrage. That same year, she organized the women's suffrage procession that was held in Washington the day before President Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated. She was determined to put pressure on Wilson because he was the one who could get Congress to listen. Unfortunately, Wilson didn't care. He didn't want to hear anything from these uppity women. And as a result, their efforts to obtain a congressional amendment did not succeed. On April 8th and 9th, 1916, the Congressional Union hosted a conference at its national headquarters in Lafayette Square in Washington. They welcomed delegates from the United States who discussed a variety of resolutions that needed to be carried back to the memberships. During the event, Alice spoke on the development of future programs and future actions that women needed to take to succeed. But unfortunately, by this point in time, some of the other women were kind of looking at her the same way they wound up looking at Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Was she too radical? Was she going to do more harm than good? But Alice didn't care. She felt it was important to take things even further, to go to the next level. So she formed the National Women's Party in 1916 and sent out a call across the country for women to come and march once again in Washington. I apologize, I get a little emotional about these things. In January of 1917, approximately 8,000 women from throughout the country turned up, bearing banners to protest in front of the White House. Over 500,000 people came out just to look at the curiosity. Women on parade, oh my. But unfortunately, some of them did not want to just look. They were there to cause trouble. And without sufficient police protection, the women were assaulted. And sometimes with the police standing right there, they were still assaulted anyway. Some of the students who were living in Washington at that time tried to help the women, but they were rarely successful. And it wasn't until the National Guard was called in that the demonstration was gotten under control. Interestingly enough, the newspapers, which was our prime method of communication in those days, sort of switched gears by this point, and suddenly they were viewing the women's cause with sympathy. And they were laughing at Wilson and his legislators for allowing this to happen. The women continued to picket outside the White House, and they became known as the Silent Sentinels, showing their contempt for President Woodrow Wilson by burning copies of his speeches. And support continued to remain strong. Yeah, okay. In Vineland, a new generation of women stepped up, women like Mrs. Oberlin Smith of Bridgeton, Mrs. L.P. Fellows of Vineland, Bessie Ayres Andrew, a native of Greenwich, who later moved to Vineland to be active in the movement. They hosted meetings, they went to conventions, and they were actively involved in the parades, but I have yet to find anything that shows them being on site for any of these events, so I don't want to make it sound like they were there. But they did their part every way that they could. Unfortunately, after the United States entered World War I in April 1917, many people started to look at the Silent Sentinels as disloyal. Their country was at war. How dare they take action against the government? Women didn't care. But that June, hundreds of them were arrested on charges of obstructing traffic. Over the next 6 months, many more, including Alice, were convicted and incarcerated at both the Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia and the District of Columbia Jail. Many women were actually surprised that these women, who were essentially well-educated, upper-crust society matrons, actually were willing to go through this type of punishment, and that they were actually sent to prison for staging nonviolent protests. Wilson, all of a sudden, became a target for a lot of folks. They trashed him in the media at every turn for doing this, and he was livid about it. So he quickly pardoned the first women that were arrested on July 19th, 2 days after they were sentenced, but abuses continued. The Boston Journal stated, "The little band representing the NWP has been abused and bruised by the government clerks, soldiers, and sailors until its efforts to attract the president's attention has sunk into the consciousness of the whole nation." The picketing continued. They were continually assaulted, arrested again. Pardons were no longer offered. Alice was sentenced to 7 months in jail on October 20th, 1917, and she was sentenced to the district jail. She tried to go on a hunger strike, so they put her in the psychiatric ward and they force-fed her raw eggs through a tube. Conditions were so bad, half the women did not want to eat. They didn't want to put on the jailhouse clothing, which was covered with lice and was filthy and infested with bugs. But it was here at this point in time that the story takes a particularly ugly turn. One of which most of you folks are probably not familiar with, because up until 2 weeks ago, I didn't know about it myself. On November 14th, 1917, the women who were imprisoned in Occoquan endured something that became known as the Night of Terror. These were 33 women who were members of the Silent Sentinels who were singled out for whippings, beatings, and torture by the superintendent of the workhouse and the guards. And the entire incident may never have come to light if it hadn't been for Lucy Burns getting a note smuggled out of the workhouse. The suffragists organized a committee to visit the workhouse in response in a hope of aiding the prisoners, and they were shocked by what they saw. Helen Todd, a committee member, later told the press, "After we had seen some of the prisoners who had been on a hunger strike, we actually wept. They were our personal friends, and they were emaciated and in a deplorable state." The newspapers ran the story everywhere on an almost daily basis. And after about 2 weeks, there was a court-ordered hearing to decide the fate of all the women who were still in prison at that time. It was decided that they had been illegally arrested, illegally convicted, and illegally tortured. However, the Night of Terror was never mentioned. President Wilson, in an effort to recapture the public's support, stated his support, suddenly, for a federal women's suffrage amendment. The war was going on. The women were needed to support the war effort. That had to come first, and they had to be free to do that, knowing that they were equally represented in government. So in 1918, a suffrage amendment passed the House of Representatives, but failed to achieve the needed majority vote in the Senate. When the Senate failed to pass the amendment, the marchers came back. And they staged more confrontational demonstrations through the year of 1918, 1919. Women climbed statues and they chained themselves to fences and burned watchfires in front of the White House. Finally, the following year, feeling the pressure of the presidency, the Senate finally passed the 19th Amendment and the ratification process was started. One senator even got a phone call from his mother, and she said to him, "You change your vote. I support women's suffrage." He went before his fellow legislators the next day and changed his vote, like a good son. And on August 26th, this is one of the cartoons that appeared in the New York Call at that point in time. On August 26, 1920, 3/4 of the state legislatures ratified the 19th Amendment. Alice Paul would continue to go on to fight for women's rights. She went on to get a law degree at the American University in 1922 and was the original author of the Equal Rights Amendment that some of us will remember, that kept trying to pass and pass and pass over the years in the 60s and 70s and never quite succeeded. Some states did build in an Equal Rights Amendment into their state constitutions. However, just so you know, New Jersey is not one of them. So, Alice died at age 92 on July 9, 1977 at a Quaker nursing facility in Moorestown. And 2 years later, she was posthumously conducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame and later into the New Jersey Hall of Fame. And in 1987, a group of New Jersey women formed the Alice Paul Institute and purchased her childhood home. And today they continue the fight. So, there you have it. Just a glimpse into some of what the early suffragists went through to gain us the rights that we enjoy today. While some are well remembered, others are not. But they did their part to support the cause. So, as I said when I started, this is a big subject, but I hope that I've given you some food for thought as to the contributions they made and what we can do to honor their legacy. Thank you, God. It's
That's
just.
okay. Why don't you have a seat, relax? That was awesome.
Oh, thank you, dear.
Of course it's emotional. Will you take a few questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, of course I have one. I was wondering when the divide became apparent with the women opposing the suffragettes, was it a socioeconomic class? Was it the women who had means that
Yes.
really picked up the traction against?
Yes, I mean, you have to realize American history is filled with people of a wealthier class speaking on behalf of their fellow citizens. I mean, we never would have had an America if it hadn't been for people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and all those folks stepping forward when they were needed. And that's why a lot of these women had a social conscience and felt they needed to speak for those who did not have a voice. But there were others who were so insulated by their sense of privilege by that point in time that they just felt, we're not going to let anything upset the existing system. They really, I don't think, understood that they were letting themselves be held captive in a system that really didn't care who they were. They didn't care how many bonnets they owned or how many horses they drove or whatever, or where they vacationed. They were happy with their life and nobody was going to take that away from them. And they saw the women's movement as a threat. So.
Also began as a temperance movement. Were these women involved with that as well?
Actually, most of these women were not. These women were, a lot of them in the spiritualist community, and they tended not to want to put those kind of standards on their fellow citizens. They just felt people should have a certain amount of rights and liberty. I mean, the mindset in Vineland seemed to be that temperance was a good thing overall. But the women that I've been able to look at, they really were not always involved with the temperance movement, so. Yes, ma'am?
If you ever get a chance to go to New York State, there's a museum for the women's suffrage, and in rather a large hall, there's a prominent statue of Dred Scott. So they made the connection between types of slavery, if you will.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the things we have in our collections at the Society is the actual scroll that was signed not just by the women, but by everyone who supported suffrage for the disenfranchised. And the thing must be about 13 feet long. And I would love the opportunity. I'm hoping one of my goals is to get enough money set aside so that I can get it preserved and hopefully copied so that we can hang a copy out on exhibit so people will get a better sense of who these people were. So, we were talking earlier about just the whole idea that people seem to really need to make it a mission to stop other people from gaining these rights for whatever reason. And, you know, we still today argue this question about who has the right to do what and be what and whatever. And it's like, why? You know, I keep going back to Charles Landis's mission, which was to give every individual every opportunity to succeed in this life. And it's like, why can't we just grow up as a species and get there? So, you know the answer to that question.
Oh, no. I was wondering about, was Mary Treat involved with this? And maybe you should talk a little bit about Mary Treat.
Oh, actually, Mary Treat actually seemed to excuse herself from most of the community activity. Mary's focus was very much on her individual studies. Mary Treat is another really wonderful character that we have in Vineland. She was an early settler there. She moved there with her husband, Joseph Treat, who was a doctor. But Joseph didn't feel that Vineland was giving him sufficient respect, and he also lusted after Victoria Woodhull. So after a few years, he left Vineland to go chase after her in New York. As far as we know, he was never successful because he actually wound up turning against the suffrage movement and saying, you know, who do these women think they are? And it was basically because he was stalking her through the streets of New York. And she said enough. But Mary Treat was a self-taught naturalist who focused on plant life and insect life, not just in Vineland, but wherever she traveled, and she discovered new species. And in fact, what's most interesting to us is the fact that she began a correspondence that went on for years with all the prominent scientists of the day, including Charles Darwin, and actually found a mistake in Mr. Darwin's research. And he went on to credit her in writing for her discovery, and later was said that he said that if it hadn't been for Mrs. Treat, his research may not have been as successful as it was. So again, the road leads back to Vineland, folks. What can I tell you?
Well, this might be a whole nother class or lecture or debate. One parting thought about one tactic that we might use to propel the ERA forward.
Get the New Jersey legislature, if nothing else, but the new Sojourn magazine that Stockton will be creating also is going to have an article I wrote on another woman. There were a lot of Marys in Vineland. Don't ask me what the attraction was, but her name was Mary Tillotson, the dress reformer. And Mary spent all of her adult life, from a young woman well into old age, supporting the cause of dress reform, even when a lot of other feminists gave up on it. She felt that this was an important cause because it would give women a healthier lifestyle. And she just traveled all across the country, just getting the word out there on dress reform, and she's one of those unsung heroes that we have right here in South Jersey. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about this subject, but to me, too much of South Jersey's history has been lost. And we have a responsibility to not only hold on to it and preserve what we have, but to uncover those stories that have yet to be told, which is why I give the folks here at Stockton a lot of credit for the work that they're doing. Not just because they're kind enough to invite me out to come and talk, but because of the exhibits and the community events and raising that profile. We've got to keep this history alive, because really what it comes down to for me in a lot of ways is, why are the children going to care if we don't teach them to care? So here's to all of you. Thank you for coming out today.